start out with this whole notion of paying it forward, doing service to your colleagues. Okay? We're all going to be trying new things here. We're all going to be assessing them. We're all going to be testing them. Some of them are going to test out better than others. Everything is not going to be a 100% success. But the important thing is that we document what we do, document it thoroughly, test what we do, test our assumptions, and disseminate it so that the people that look at what we're doing have a really good understanding of what we tried to do and what we were successful at. So that's how we serve our colleagues, right? By explaining in as much detail as possible what we do. That's part of research. If you haven't figured it out already, we all have a very strong vested interest in your success. That's why we're here today. And as I said, we challenge ourselves every day to figure out ways that we can help you be successful. Being successful at research is part of that. Successful implementation of research in the SPI projects requires at least 3 things that I'll be going over in a few minutes regarding implementation research, performance measurement, and improving the measurement of effectiveness. So those are the 3 mini lessons in my little thing today. Mike Scott said yesterday, research priorities should not trump police priorities. Right? Excellent comment. So sound research practice has to be implemented in the context of good, effective policing. That's not easy. It's always been a challenge, right? We are going to challenge the police folks and the researchers to help make that happen better than it's happened in the past. And it is really, it's difficult. It's going to kind of question you at your core sometimes. And we're going to end up with something I really like to talk about since I've been observing these research partnerships for many years. There are many things that researchers bring to the table that we don't always think about in terms of police projects. So we want to talk a little bit about how researchers can be helpful, not just as research technicians, but as team partners and team players. Okay, so highlight the need for improved knowledge and insight on police performance, review some guidelines and standards about what those terms actually mean. I took the liberty of culling through some of your project proposals to just bring forth some examples about how research is being planned and utilized in these projects. So we're going to have a couple examples about what we're talking about here. And as I said, we're going to articulate some specific key roles that researchers can play, above and beyond collecting and analyzing data that will help your project be successful. Okay, this you've heard a little bit about already, and I'm sure some of you are aware of this. I want to call our attention to it again. There was a series of articles that came out in Criminology and Public Policy in February of this year. Dave Weisberg and John Eck and a couple others wrote the original article. Mike Scott had a contribution to this series of articles. Tony Braga from Boston had a very interesting commentary on that research. And a guy that I really, really like a lot named Nick Tilley from London also had a very interesting commentary on this whole research idea. But the fundamental issue that was presented in this article is that Dave Weisberg and John Eck and several others looked at over 5,000 studies that had been done on police effectiveness. Some of them were published reports, some of them were for referee journals, some of them were reports that were published, but 5,000 reports that addressed whether or not a police intervention or police project or police-led project had been effective. They took a very close, it must have taken them years to do this. I mean, they had to read them all. They looked at 15 different points and methodologies and everything. I think it was somewhere around 5,700. In their opinion, and according to the standards that they used, 10 of those 5,000 articles had substantial methodological rigor to warrant confidence in the results. 10. Now, I have been a fan of problem-oriented policing, of community policing, of strategic approaches to policing for 15 or 20 years. In my heart, I feel very confident that it works and it's a good thing to do. I was surprised by this. To have 10 articles out of over 5,000, they didn't all say that the policing didn't work. A lot of them said it did work. They just didn't have enough sound methodology behind them to warrant a high amount of confidence that either it worked where they did or it worked in such a way that is generalizable to somewhere else. Okay? So, those of us who teach this stuff and who live this stuff are wondering, what is the foundation upon which policing research is saying? It looks to be like it's a little bit shaky, according to this. Okay? Some of us have done that research. Okay? Some of us have worked with police where the police priorities have trumped the research priorities. So we understand why this happens. And quite frankly, we don't complain about it a lot because we want to help. We want to be helpful, right? But in the end, we have 10 studies out of 5,000 that research experts say meet methodological rigor to have confidence in the results. Okay? So if we do anything in these projects, when we document them and when we assess them, we must do it with methods that give us confidence, greater confidence than we've had in the past, that what we're doing is making a difference. Okay? So that's going to lead us to a couple very specific points about what needs to be done. The references to these articles are in your materials. They'll be up on the website. I highly recommend anybody, if you haven't seen them yet, if you're a researcher or if you're a police practitioner, to take a look at these articles. They're very good. Nick Tilley, he talks about how, you know what, policing is a tough job. You should all be thankful that they're doing any research. And so he's got a good realistic perspective. But it's a very interesting series. Tony Braga has some very good practical recommendations for how to address this issue without forcing classic experimental designs down the throats of police agencies, which we could never do anyway. So very instructive, very important. That's kind of the message for today. If we're going to improve the methods with which we study and assess what you're doing, 3 things have to happen. Thorough documentation of what you're doing, measuring your activities routinely and consistently, performance measurement, and measuring your outcomes, hopefully, with comparative designs. Quite frequently in police research, when we have pre- and post studies without comparative design, we miss a few things. And we lose a little bit of confidence that we want to have that what we're doing makes a difference. So we'll talk about this a little further, okay? Having said that, I also want to stress that if you study your projects intensely and with rigor, you're going to find problems. You're not going to be successful all the time. You're just going to turn up some things that other designs wouldn't necessarily turn up. Not a bad thing. If you try something and it doesn't work, and you have thoroughly documented it and tested it, you're doing a service to everybody. It's much better to do that than to do a study that says it works when it doesn't really work that well. Right? Then you're talking about wasting a ton of money and a ton of people's time. Okay, so here's what we think about when we talk about thorough documentation. Okay? Keeping records of all meetings and decisions. When I go in and do a study of a research or a police organization or something like that, that's the first question I ask. Let me see who's been making decisions at meetings, what's been decided, who's kind of driving this machine here, right? So just keeping track of all your decisions, very important. Basic data on inputs and activities and milestones reached. I'll say more about that in a little bit. Several of you have actually keyed into this next point. Let's keep track of our partnership. Let's keep track of our key collaborators. Let's measure how they're doing, how they're thinking, how they're feeling about things as we go along. Okay? That's important. That will actually tell you some interesting things along the way. If people start to stray a little bit or you start to lose a little confidence, then you'll learn some good things about just keeping track of the impressions of the people that you're working with, or even the offenders that you're working with. Developing descriptive accounts of events and activities. I mentioned this a little bit yesterday about these letter pulling sessions, these offender notification sessions. Rick Pender was kind enough to let me know last night that there actually is a documentary video that's been done on this. So we will make it available to you. But just doing good, thorough case studies and telling people how you do what you do in a detailed way is a very important thing to do. It's well and good to talk about a notification session and describe how it goes. I'm telling you, to see one in action is really an educational experience. Obviously, when you run into trouble, which we all will, you do some problem solving on your own. So let's keep track of how we solve our problems. If we have to divert on our target a little bit, or divert on our community engagement a little bit, or make a little change in the plan here or there, it's very important for you, for your colleagues, for BJA, to understand why that change was made. It's not going to get you in trouble. You're not going to be looked down on. It doesn't affect you in any way. We will thank you very much for documenting those kinds of things. Those are really the little kernels of information that other people really need to learn about. Okay, so let's go to performance measurement. Generally speaking, I actually tried to find a single good definition of performance measurement for about 3 weeks before I came here. I can't find one that I'm happy with. Okay, so performance measurement sometimes, in my terminology, refers to bean counting, right? Measuring what you're doing, measuring what matters, keeping track of those key activities and decisions over time and consistently. When other people describe it, they describe it as achieving objectives, measuring inputs, outputs, and outcomes over time. So generally speaking, performance measurement refers to what we call process evaluation, implementation studies, right? Measuring what you do and how you do it, and outcome, which is impact. Did you have the desired effect? Did you achieve change in the communities and the individuals that you're concerned about? So performance measurement has a couple different meanings to it. I'm going to put a little meat on the bone here in a minute. One thing that we learned from the articles I mentioned earlier is that when pre-post studies are used to assess the effectiveness of police projects or interventions, they almost invariably find positive results. Most of the time, in a pre-post measure design, in a problem-solving or police implementation project, you will find positive outcomes. Most of the time. Okay? The problem is we're missing the comparative piece. That's what that refers to. Okay, so what do we miss when we only do the pre and post studies? There's this little thing called the history effect. The history effect is simply when you're going about your business and you're doing your work and you're doing your implementations and your interventions faithfully, something happens that you didn't plan for, that changes the nature or the dynamics of what's happening in your communities. You could change it in a way that the crime goes up. You could change it in a way that crime goes down. But something could happen just in the course of time while you're doing your work that bears no relation to what you're doing that could change things. Several examples might be, so if you're doing your SPI project and there's a PSN project going on and there's a weed and seed and 6 other things going on in the same community, it's going to be hard for you to identify what you did, right? Here's a dramatic example. You're working on gang issues. You're going along. For one reason or another, they decide to call troops. Has nothing to do with what you're doing. You weren't involved in it. You didn't help facilitate this. They simply decide to shut down for a couple months. Right? Crime goes down. We did it. Right? If all you're doing is measuring the pre and post without having another community to compare to or another site to compare to, you won't be able to identify, at least easily identify, if it was what you did that caused that downturn in crime or something else. Okay? Displacement has come up in a couple times. I think there's actually some interesting approaches to handling displacement in these projects. It's important. There are methodologies that you can use. If you're not familiar with, we can help you track this matter. Vitally important that if you're focusing in one particular area or in several particular areas and you achieve success, that you look other places just to get a handle on if this is what's happening. If I have enough time, remind me to tell you about my smokestack theory. I don't know about it. Okay, so if you're doing pre-post studies, you don't necessarily get these lessons learned in implementation. Okay? So our message and our suggestion, obviously, is that if you're not doing comparative studies, every site here should be thinking about it, and there are some options available to you to improve these designs. Okay, so here's one example that I think should be fairly clear about basic monitoring and measuring the implementation of what you're doing. How many of us here understand what a lever pulling meeting is? These offender notification. Pretty much, it's when you have reason to bring a number of your targeted offenders into a room, into a location, and have them sitting there facing you, and you deliver to them the message that you want them to get. Right? We know where you were 3 nights ago when this incident happened on 4th Street. And we know who you were hanging out with that night. You know, we can't pin it to you, but we're watching you. Right? We know who you're hanging out with, and we think maybe you were involved in something that's happening over there. So you confront them. Let them know, with all of your colleagues around you, the feds and the states and the locals and the community groups and the churches, that we're all here because we're concerned about you and we're watching you. If you want to, all these people here will help you. If you don't want to and you continue to do what you're doing, then you're going to look at some pretty hard time and some pretty focused investigations, that kind of thing. Okay? It has been very effective. Right? How many places are you guys doing this in North Carolina?
We have about 9 cities in the Middle District.
Yeah. So, if you wanted to know with certainty that this was, number one, occurring the way you wanted it to occur, and if you were measuring whether or not crime is going up or down, or at least crime in this particular group of offenders is going up or down, you would first want to know, are these notification meetings being implemented with fidelity? Are they going the way they're supposed to go? Are we continually maintaining a high level of quality in how we implement these meetings? So you would simply identify the 4 or 5 things that make these meetings a success. That's not hard to do, right? Plan it, orchestrate it well, get the participants there that need to be there, have the offenders there, make sure that there's a clear, concise message that's delivered consistently every time, right? Check and see if the people who were in the room that you invited there, the offenders, actually listened and understood what you were telling them, right? Then you can check and see if they behave differently in the afterward, okay? This is not hard to do. If you're focusing on offender notification, and you're serious about understanding how it's being implemented, you would simply monitor it this way or something like this. 4 or 5 things that you know have to happen consistently to make sure that these run the way that they're supposed to do. If they're not running the way they're supposed to do, it will not be long before you get some feedback from your research partner that says, guess what? You know what? For the last 7 meetings, half the participants have been there. Something's not working right? Mid-course correction. How do we get the people there? How do we get the participants there? This is important. You can do this for most of the key aspects of your strategies, whether it's community meetings, if it's your own team meetings. How do you know when you have an effective gathering and a meeting of collaborators? Well, several things have to happen. They have to be there, you have to have a focused agenda, you have to have full participation, etc., etc., etc. It would not be hard to just monitor how those meetings go. If the maintenance of a strong collaboration over a long period of time is something that's a key component of what you're doing, why would you not track it and monitor it? Just so you could be sure that they're happy the way they're supposed to, and if they start to get a little off track, you can catch it very quickly. Okay? This is performance measurement. I grabbed this from one of the proposals. There's a component about officer-driven POC responses. I like that a lot, okay? They're talking about POC-oriented policing, but they're focusing on the fact that more so than in the past, in this particular site, these approaches are supposed to be officer-driven. Street officers make decisions and empowered to do this work, right? If that's true, if that's what you're trying to do, and that is one of your goals, to have the officers driving it more, then there's some things that you should be looking at, right? Before and after. What is the nature and the quality of officer participation in these problem-solving exercises, right? How do they feel about it? Are they just going through the motions? Are they enthusiastically participating? Do they feel like when they say something, they're actually listened to? What do the clientele think? Are they picking up anything in terms of changes in officer participation and officer behavior, right? Then, just find a couple areas that look similar to the areas that you're working in and study officer participation in those areas. That's the comparative piece. Here's another look at how you might approach this measurement issue from a couple different perspectives. So traditionally, if you have a bunch of POC projects that you're initiating, you track the number of them, you track the number of them that are completed, you track the quality with which they're implemented, right? And you track the indicators. Are they addressing successfully the problems that they targeted in the first place? If you were to enhance this a little bit, you would study them, all right, the number of them, started and completed. You would get some interesting measures on, again, quality of these things. Who's participating? How much are they participating? Are they faithfully going through the SARA model to get to the end of their projects? Crime and safety. Are there any new collaborations coming out of this? Any new ideas that are being generated? Any add-on value of these POC projects that you might not have gotten before? Right? Are they resulting in the incorporation of any new techniques or technology? So tracking things, but looking for other things that you would expect to happen as a result of a good problem-solving process. Then, to make it comparative, right, you simply have to find other areas that are not doing this and study the same things in those areas. Okay? If you have a bunch of very creative, energetic police supervisors, you might find that there's a bunch of new, interesting techniques and technology in other areas that are not taking place in your POC areas. Okay? So, this is also taken from the proposals and the research designs. We have a number of interesting process-oriented measures that you're talking about. Tracking working group progress, surveying officer satisfaction with various technologies, studying the training that you provide. Excellent idea. Right? If training is a key component of what you're doing, you should not only be documenting who's getting it, how often, can you look at the quality of that training? Is it being implemented with high quality every time it's being done? Okay? Then we get to these pre-post methodologies, or some of them are post-only. Looking at daily activity reports. Right? You should be seeing a difference in the way police approach their activity reports if you're being successful with what you're doing. Qualitative observation by researcher ride-alongs. I like this. Offender interviews. Okay? If you're changing the behavior of individual offenders, it makes sense, if you can, to actually talk to them and survey them and get them in some focus groups and find out what they have to say. It's amazing what you learn from that kind of exercise. Then we get to the comparative designs. Comparative analysis of offenders in targeted and non-targeted hotspots. pre or post surveys in treatment and control sites, random assignment of interventions to treatment and control locations with pre and post measures. That's about as good as it gets. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody has the resources to do that. But when we talk about studying our interventions with confidence, it's amazing. If somebody can pull off randomization, that's good. Normally, we use some matching techniques. We find some comparison sites, and that's a good quasi-experimental design. But this is what we drew from the plans that you sent in. Okay. Other ways that you can improve your research designs if you can't do all this quasi-experimentation. In addition to just looking at a couple data points before you do your intervention and a couple data points afterwards, it's always a good idea if you can get to do a nice historical trend analysis. Right? So if crime was high in year 1 and low in year 2, interesting news. If crime was going like this for the last 10 years, that makes it a little difficult to attribute what you did to the success that you observed, because it would have gone that way anyway. So just looking a little further back in time, looking at these time series and these trends is always a helpful thing to do. I'm very fond of giving these interventions enough time to take hold. So if you're implementing something, it's not going to happen overnight. Usually there's a couple months, maybe even up to 6 months or more, before an intervention that you're introducing to a community or with a group of offenders has a chance to really take effect in such a way that the measures that you're making can pick up any difference. So it's not just year 1, year 2. It's a year or 2 before, 3 to 6 months of intervention, then look and see the changes. Okay? You have to give it a chance to take hold. Where possible, I think for this enough today, comparison or control groups. This is something that I'm also kind of fond of. If you have address-based interventions, okay. If you have address, is that for the whole thing or for my part? Thank you. Even I can't make it. If you're focusing on particular addresses, what we mostly do is we measure activity before and after at those addresses. Okay? If those addresses are in public places, I think it's fair to assume that activity at an address may be visible by people around that within a half a block radius or so. So if you're sophisticated enough with your mapping analysis, you can actually identify an address and a little catchment area around the address where you would expect maybe a little spillover effect of what you're doing. Okay? And then anything that's outside that area, you measure to look for displacement. Okay? So there are some techniques that are available to you that are not hard to do that will help you make some of these measurements. Okay? Multiple measures. If you're only relying on police administrative data to measure the things that you're trying to change, you should try and get some other pieces of information. Again, surveying offenders, making community observations, these are all very helpful. If you're making these multiple measures and they start to converge and tell you similar stories, that gives you more confidence. If you make multiple measures and the police data tell you one thing and your officer surveys tell you something completely different, you have some more work to do. Okay. And as I said, document everything as well as. Okay. These are 3 examples from your sites that have actually proposed these pre-post comparative designs. Philadelphia, they're looking for each of the hot spots, those micro spots that they identify, 3 years of prior data. Right? That's that trend analysis I'm talking about. And then following up as much as they can afterwards. They're looking at the crime analyst production of reports, right? Police behavior. I think Noah has an excellent point about behavior in her presentation today. Citizen satisfaction, right? Officer satisfaction. So they've taken everything that they're doing and they're measuring it in 3 or 4 very important ways, and they're using comparison sites. This is why we want to see what comes out of Philly, because they have a really good approach to the analysis part of it. Okay? Lansing, pre-post implementation surveys, observations of participants, offender participation interviews. If you have not done offender participation interviews, and you haven't thought about it, or you think that you can't do it or don't know how to do it, talk to Ed McGarrett. Okay? We'll help you talk to Ed McGarrett. He has really done a very good job of testing the assumptions of his interventions or his department's interventions through these offender interviews. And very important information for his research. Boston, analysis of calls for service, incident-based data, qualitative community interviews, working group report summaries, trend analysis, and comparable hotspots. Okay? Good combination of hard measures and qualitative approaches to studying what they're trying to do. Okay? All right, so I have how many minutes? 2 or 3? Good. I'm getting there. Okay, researchers. They have with them a number of things in their toolbox that can be helpful to you. Okay? They don't just come with a pencil and a survey and a calculator. There's much more to these individuals than we sometimes think. Okay? Most of them are fairly well-read in these problem-oriented policing strategies, these hotspots, this mapping technology. They have very extensive networks around the country, around the world, of people who are studying these things all over the place. So when you ask them a question, you're not just asking Scott Decker a question, you're asking Scott Decker and everybody that he's worked with for the past 20 years a question. And more often than not, he's got 6 or 7 good answers for you. Okay? Researchers really, they really warm up to these projects. And so if you include them in team meetings, put them on working groups, they make very interesting, often very insightful observations about what you're doing, what the possibilities for measurement are, what some of the pitfalls are, if you're going to rush to a conclusion that you think you've solved the problem, and that kind of thing. So they're very creative, and they're very inquisitive, they're very critical, and they always cover a lot of bases before they're going to give you kind of a final answer. Sometimes they get you into places where you have a hard time getting into. So if you're doing community work and you're interviewing offenders, a good researcher will get a lot more information out of some community members or some offenders than an officer or a crime analyst. Okay? So they can be very helpful in that way. So as I said, consider them as a team of work group leaders. Use them as liaison to various audiences. If you're working with information systems, they actually work with information systems a lot, so they can help you understand quality of information that you're looking at, not just the measures that you're making. Okay. They're very helpful periodically in coming back to the team and giving some feedback. Right? Letting the team know when they might want to consider some adjustments, or they might want to reconsider some of the assumptions that they made going into these projects. So let's not just consider them as send them out to the community before, wait 18 months and send them out to the community afterwards and get their report. They could be used more effectively than that. Okay? Very quickly, sometimes there's a little bit of a culture clash here. Integrating a researcher into a police agency or a police operation is not always an easy thing to do. And many of us will admit that not all researchers are the same. They're not all sensitive to what police are doing. They don't easily integrate themselves into police operations. So sometimes you have to be careful about who you pick as a researcher. Okay? Quite often, especially if they're not tenured, they're working under pressures, right? These are the university pressures that the police have nothing to say about, right? They're up for promotion, they got to publish or perish, they're teaching 4 classes a semester, and so their deadlines and their timelines, and sometimes their priorities are not the same as yours. You've got to pay attention to that. It's very important to have a healthy discussion about that before you launch into this partnership. Okay? Most often, you can work it out, but it is something to pay attention to. What I'm going to do now is turn this over Gary French. Gary has either the pleasure or the pain or both of working with researchers for the better part of 10 years, and he's got some, real-world information to tell you. So thanks a lot, Gary. You want to know?
I thought I was going to say the pleasure or pain of presenting here today, but working with researchers has been a very positive experience for me over the years. I've had the opportunity to work with Jack and David out of Northeastern on racial profiling issues, Maureen North Walk out of Suffolk on human trafficking, Scott Decker on phone calls and banging ideas off his head in the middle of the night, Anthony Braga from Kennedy School of Government. Dave Kennedy was with the, working with Anthony for a period of time. I worked quite a bit with him also on fellow. Some of his theories that he put out there. It's interesting working with researchers. They have agendas coming from the university that could conflict with the different types of goals and objectives that we have with the police department. One of the benefits of working with Harvard University, in particular, the Kennedy School, was looking at our violent crime problem, looking at who the perpetrators were, who the victims were, nailing them down to a very small percentage of the kids in the 16 and 24-year-old range that were gang involved, reviewing the homicides and making a determination of a homicide is a big thing in the police department. It's a really accurate number of accurate reflection of how we're doing on violent crime. But homicides can be broken down into a whole bunch of different categories. And looking at the gang homicides, which is a big interest to me, tells me that we're moving in the right direction on those issues that we're dealing with and trying to reduce gang violence in the city and reducing the shootings in the city related to these very small percentage of kids that are driving a vast majority of violent crime.
Next slide.
I think I do. I don't need an answer. Okay. When I came on the job, years ago, I used to come into work and read the read the police reports, and that's the way I got information about what was going on the division that I was working. Now we have the Boston Regional Intelligence Center. Everything's computerized. There's massive amounts of data that come into the Boston Police Department, are collected and fed back to us as police managers now. But analyzing that data is unbelievable. There's massive amounts of data on house breaks, car breaks, larcenies, robberies, shootings, gang kids impact players, intelligence reports that are coming in from street level officers that are collected in the BRIC, Regional Intelligence Center, and then fed back to us. And we can really use research partners to sort of work with us on that. We've been fortunate in Boston. We've had Anthony Braga that's sort of like embedded almost with our police department. He works part-time at Harvard and part-time in the police department. He's well known by most of the people in the department, most of the managers, and he works real well with us. One of the issues that I always come up and I always argue with Anthony and talk about with Anthony and different research partners is, he's always looking for the perfect study. A study that has control areas and whatever else researchers need. Talking about, some of the 10 research projects that actually have an accurate review of them that were done. Police officers don't care about that. Police officers care about, identifying a problem, looking at best practices, and attacking that problem. We have 4 or 5 neighborhoods in Boston that are experiencing real bad problems with violent crime. 5% of the geographical area of the city experiences 50% of the homicides. When we look at that, we say, well, we have to hit that 5% of the neighborhoods. We can't leave one out. We have to hit them all if we want to affect violent crime. One of the interesting things about working with academics is there's all different types of academics. And the police, as we know, have our own culture. Our culture is different from just about any other culture We have our own language. We have little uniforms we wear. We have tools that we carry. All this stuff sort of sets us apart from everyone else. And academics have their own culture too. They're interested in ballot studies and all that stuff that was talked about earlier. We don't really care about that. We're looking for results. We're looking for what works, what's going to bail us out. We're looking at crime stats, the same as researchers. If they're going down, we're happy. If they're going up, we've got to answer to it. ComStat now. We have monthly meetings, bi-weekly meetings. We're put on the hot seat and asked about how come these numbers are going up. And congratulations that they're going down. And sometimes we don't have a clue as to why they're going up or why they're going down. We just sort of ride along with it. You get an academic who comes in and says, well, this is why it's going down. And if it's going up, this is what you can do to bring it down. So we have great academics in Boston. Been very fortunate to work with them. We have some academics that aren't that good also, and I don't want to bang anybody. Scott did not attend to you at all, I remember a time in working with Anthony. Like I said, he's embedded in the police department. It's more like 15 years been working with Anthony. He's a tremendous guy, and we trust him. I trust him. He's a good friend of mine. But in order to establish that trusting relationship, police officers have to work on it. You have to stay in touch. You have to trust the person. And if it's the wrong person, you're not going to stay in touch. You're not going to trust them. The relationship has to develop over a period of time. One time Anthony had a graduate student sitting in for him. And Anthony tells me, this guy, I can trust him, he's cool, he's squared away, work with him. I said, no problem. And the kid shows up, he's 23 or 24 years old. I have a bunch of senior police managers in there, and he's telling the managers what to do. And I'm sitting there scratching my head saying, this ain't going to work. That kid wasn't welcome back. I called up Anthony, I said, Anthony, who is this guy? I said, he was out of line. Challenging, deputy superintendents about what they're talking about, and it was ugly. And I'm sitting there wearing, so to speak, because I'm working with Anthony, and Anthony tells me this guy's split away. So anyhow, Anthony talked to the kid, and the kid wound up becoming squared away after surprising with Anthony and myself that hey, you can't behave that way at these meetings. You sit back, relax, listen to what's going on, and make suggestions, possibly after the meetings, to the police managers as to a better way to go about the business. That's not always the case. This kid is doing well now, studying for his PhD over at Kennedy School of Sociology. The other thing that is interesting, and you see, like Boston, it's a neighborhood, a city of neighborhoods. There's 15 to 20 very important neighborhoods in the city. Some of those neighborhoods experience a tremendous amount of violent crime. When we go in there to work in the neighborhood, everybody knows what we're doing. If we have a project going on, or we're doing an initiative, and we're trying to set up control areas, that makes headaches for us. Everyone's making phone calls. How come you're getting double police response here, and we're getting the same consistent response? A lot of pressure comes on us, and we have to explain it, and we can't say, well, we want a perfect study. It just doesn't work that way. So we have to really be conscious of that in how we're working with researchers, what the control areas are. I think Philadelphia has that issue we're going to be looking at.